This is not about more history, this is about very biased, activist-led, agenda-driven historical narratives.
Coming up on British thought leaders, Zewditu Gebreyohanes on preserving our heritage in the age of identity politics.
We are seeing British history denigrated, British historical figures denigrated, a lot of very silly and very ahistorical black and white, you know, this person was evil, this person was good, just because of modern identity politics.
Zewditu talks about the impact of young people learning a largely negative view of British history.
You know, that they will be brought up with a mindset that is incredibly anti-British. If they swallow all this and if they take it all and they're uncritical about it, you know, we're doing our enemy's work for them.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Zewditu Gebreyohanes, Senior Researcher at the Legatum Institute. Zewditu, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So you've dedicated your career to heritage so far. You're a trustee at the V&A Museum, you were head of History Matters at Policy Exchange think tank. And why is it important to celebrate our heritage and remember our history?
Well, it's very important because it's important that young people in particular have an interest in the past, I think. In general, history is important because only by understanding the past can you understand the present and therefore know what to do to improve things and to move forward. So I think history is very important. Celebrating heritage is also very important because otherwise, you know, you need to have a sense of national pride, a sense of belonging, and you know, when there are huge questions of defence and things like that, and without the national pride as a sort of bedrock, a foundation, you can't really move on to how do we defend our nation, for example. So I think you really need to have an understanding of and appreciation for the past.
I wanted to briefly touch on a couple of the papers you did at History Matters. The first one was this trend for renaming streets after the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. And can you talk us through your paper on that?
There was a whole zeitgeist at that time, and it's, you know, it's still there a bit. But at that time, a lot of the councils wanted to rename streets based on, you know, often very tenuous links to slavers of the past. In some cases, it was people who may have had links to slavery, or names like Black Boy Lane, which might be offensive to people, actually were nothing to do with black boy in a sort of 21st century sense. They were sort of, some of those names were after Charles II, for example, or the chimney sweeps that were going up the chimneys and coming out dark-skinned because of the soot. So there wasn't a lot of historical accuracy or particular yearning for truth in a lot of this. It was very knee-jerk. And so the paper was trying to say, let's take a step back, and instead of doing knee-jerk things, if we actually really want to change a street name, and we think that there is a, you know, if a council thinks that there is a proper reason why it should be renamed, you should ask the residents on the street, the businesses on the street, the taxpayers, and say, are you willing for this change to happen? Because ultimately you're going to have emergency services, you know, getting confused about, hello, what's happened to X street, which has had its name, you know, changed to Y, or have, you know, and businesses having to rename their, you know, update their records, things like that, totally just inconvenience to people.
And a lot
so
of
if you
costs
get,
as well.
yeah, absolutely, with loads of costs, and if there is a super majority of people on the street, taxpayers who want the street to be renamed, then that's fair enough. But I think in a lot of these cases there wasn't even a desire to know whether the people wanted it to happen. It was sort of the council decides and therefore this will happen. And you know, it was mostly Labour councils doing this, but it was because it was fashionable at the time rather than because it was needed. So if you lived on Starlin Lane, maybe 2/3 of the people on the street do want it renamed with good reason. And you know, but let's leave it to to a democratic process and see what the supermajority wants.
You also did a paper on Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew,
yes,
and they talked about decolonising their plant collection, probably the best plant collection in the world. What does decolonising plants involve, and what happened after you published your paper?
Well, to be perfectly honest, it was much more rhetoric-based. They were doing lots of talks. You know, they were talking about we're decolonizing our plants. I don't think they really understood what they meant by that. I certainly didn't. What I did understand, working on the History Matters unit at Policy Exchange, which was all about making sure institutions were being run according to their statutory remits, was that this firmly was not within Kew's remit, because Kew was set up to educate people about the science of plants, not to be decolonizing its plant collection. I mean, it just is. The two things don't really match up. So when we did point this out in the paper, and I co-authored the paper, by the way, with Ursula Buchan and Professor Christopher Forsyth, but Kew abandoned the project within 2 weeks. So it was actually, once you start showing, institutions, look, you're going down the wrong path, it can have an impact.
This institutions not following their statutory aim seems to be an ongoing theme. A lot of museums and galleries now, they're moving towards this more progressive way of curating their exhibits.
Yes.
What do you think the impact is of repackaging our history in that way?
I think it's very damaging, because actually, a lot of the time it's presented to us as a sort of, here we are presenting an unvarnished, account of history. Whereas in fact, a lot of the time they are deliberately tarnishing our history. It's not at all unvarnished. There's just a different narrative being put on it. So it's, let's go from one narrative, which actually was pretty watered down. So it was nothing like the jingoistic accounts of the past. A pretty normal account. Let's go from that to very, very heavily anti-tradition, anti-British in lots of cases, account where we are just slandering historical figures, and making the next generation of Britons think this is an awful country with an awful past, it's just taken totally out of proportion. So it's not even, let's try and add a bit more context, a bit more history, because a lot of people do like more history. This is not about more history. This is about very biased, activist-led, agenda-driven historical narrative. So I think it's very bad, I think. Yeah, I'm very much against it.
Do you feel there's a kind of anti-Western movement in society now, like the achievements of the West and the traditions of the West being pushed down?
Yeah, I think there is, and which is very sad, because actually you would expect every country to be trying to make its people proud of it, and we see a lot of positive nationalism in other countries, and why should we be ultra critical? Every country has good and bad things in its history. Every single country. Most countries have had slavery in their history. That doesn't mean that because you had slavery, you are evil, and your history is evil. All your ancestors are evil. Particularly given that basically every other civilization also had it. So I think very important to tell the history of the past for the reason I said earlier, which is that only by learning about the past properly can we correct those mistakes and learn from them for the future. But that's very different to absolutely tarring everyone with the same brush, and or trying to say that because this person lived in this time period and probably had links to this thing, he's on the bad list. Is just such a wrong approach to take. And for example, lots of institutions choose to focus on the negative links to slavery and don't talk about the abolitionist links that they had. Abolitionism was a very, very big thing in British history, and there was, it was a very fraught thing at the time, of course, but there were people who really, really fought for this, and in the end, when the slave trade was abolished, the Navy, the British Navy did a lot to try and stop the transatlantic slave trade. So I think there is a lot to be celebrated, and of course a lot to be criticised. Nobody's saying that we are beyond criticism, but it's just very important that all of that's balanced and very historical.
So there's a lot to celebrate and a lot to criticise, but it seems the focus is always on the kind of dark side of things. I mean, what's the end goal of that, do you think? Why do they just focus on that one side?
Well, it's very odd, because you would think that our enemies, our nation's enemies would be absolutely revelling in all this. I'm sure they love the sound of Britons, young Britons, the future sort of leaders, the future army, the future everyone, who will be running the country, that they will be brought up with a mindset that is incredibly anti-British. If they swallow all this and if they take it all and they're uncritical about it, we're doing our enemy's work for them. So I'm not really sure what the motivation is. It doesn't sound like a very useful thing down the line, but it certainly is. It certainly is very sad. It's very difficult. But you do see a pattern that in a lot of these things, in a lot of these cases, we are seeing British history denigrated, British historical figures denigrated, a lot of very silly and very ahistorical black and white, this person was evil, this person was good, just because of modern identity politics, when in fact the person they're saying is good had a lot of flaws, just as any historical figure does, and the person they're saying is evil did a lot of good as well. So, all of us have, every human has flaws. The greater a historical figure you are, the more likely you are to have either done made mistakes, or those mistakes being known to the public.
A classic example of this is Churchill. I know you have published some papers on Churchill. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I did a project on Churchill, again at Policy Exchange, with the History Matters policy unit. That was with Andrew Roberts, so of course, a very celebrated, proper Churchill expert. And what we were doing was pushing back against claims that were made about Churchill at, of all places, Churchill College, Cambridge.
Right.
And, it was, the Churchill College was, of course, named after Churchill. And yet these academics were being incredibly one-sidedly, critical of Churchill, and seeking to play down the positive things he did, and say that he was a sort of very racist man who, for example, wanted to get rid of the Indians, which is, just ludicrous claims. There were. You can read the paper if you like, because we've highlighted some of the absolutely unbelievable claims they were trying to make. We're not talking about serious historical debates on, Churchill's legacy or what Churchill did. We're talking about a very, very one-sided thing that you wouldn't expect at such a prestigious college or university. And again, that got disbanded. So the working group, having pushed back against some of the claims that were being made and saying, this is not actually historical, it's not what one would expect, this working group on Churchill called Churchill, Race and Empire was disbanded within a month. And apparently the Policy Exchange pamphlet had been circulated to the trustees of I think it was the trustees or the board of the college when they made that decision. So again, you can have an impact often on a smaller scale when when there is sufficient pushback and when the media get involved in particular.
So you were previously director of Restore Trust, which is a grassroots campaign to get the National Trust back to its statutory aims.
Yes.
Historian Patrick Wright said the National Trust is the ethereal holding company for the spirit of the nation. What do you think he meant by that? Why is the National Trust so important?
Well, the National Trust is very important because it holds a lot of our nation's heritage, whether that's natural or man-made. So it has lots of historic houses, coastline, forest, you name it. It's got a lot. And these are things, of course, that we want preserved forever. And in its statutory, objects, the National Trust is meant to be preserving these places for the nation for forever. It's always been very nice to know that there's a charity supported by statute to protect it, preserving these wonderful places forever. The sad thing is, of course, that the current management have been leading it astray from what it's been meant to be doing. So it hasn't really been doing that, and so many people have been leaving and become disillusioned. And that's what we are doing at Restore Trust, and what Restore Trust continues to highlight.
Jacob Rees-Mogg said that cultural communism had been foisted on the millions of members of the National Trust. Can you give us some examples of what he was talking about?
I think what Jacob means when he talks about cultural communism is the way in which generally left-wing, but also culturally, culturally left-wing. So, for example, anti-tradition mindset has really taken over in the trust. And it's very much... I think they're really trying to undermine the historic houses in particular. I think they're seen by the current management as being unhelpful, unless they're very commercially viable. But in terms of cultural communism, I mean, it goes far and wide. I mean, they've got all sorts of projects, the decolonization things, colonial countryside project, the slavery and colonialism report. So we do have a lot of agenda-driven, activist-led historical projects at the National Trust. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier, very much not about more history or better history, but about history that fits their agenda.
The Director General of the National Trust said 70% of her staff will be regarded as progressive activists. You think this is kind of part of the problem? Obviously, the over 5 million members wouldn't be a majority progressive people, but the chasm between their ethos and that of the management.
Yes, I do have to say I slightly doubt that 70% of the staff would be progressive activists. I've met a lot of staff who very much are not progressive activists. I think she's probably right at the headquarters, and that in itself is reflective of a big problem in the National Trust management. They surround themselves with people like them, with the same sorts of views, and then imagine that everyone in the public agrees with that small group of people. I think there's very little interest, actually, in what the majority of people think or what the majority of members think. But the falling volunteer numbers, which have not really been, seen, nobody's been talking about that in the media, I think are a signal of even their own people, not even set aside the members, their numbers have also been falling. But the volunteer numbers, that they've been falling quite significantly in the last few years, I think say a lot, from sort of 53,000 in COVID times to under 40,000 this year. Not reported on, because the National Trust has been quite oblique about all of this. But I think that's not a very good sign. And it all started, the volunteer numbers started dropping from about 2017 when the rainbow lanyards were being introduced. And that's when we first saw a drop in volunteer numbers. So it's sort of, imposing things on members, volunteers, it's not really... I think there is a chasm. It's not only with the members, I think, it's also among the volunteers who are the backbone of the Trust.
Taking a step back from all of this, there's a Grade 1 listed National Trust property called Tintersfield House. It's like an amazing Victorian house. It installed this, what can really be described as, looks like streams of excrement coming out of the fireplace and the bed and the furniture. There was obviously some public pushback, but at the same time some people said, this is good, it adds to the staid Victorian environment of the house. Do you think this is kind of indicative of a problem that we have in our culture now? It's difficult for people to appreciate tradition and beauty, and they're always looking for a kind of sensational disruption.
Yes, but also, the project, the installation, I mean, which is actually disgusting, and I would encourage I would encourage anyone watching this to go and have a look at this installation, look up Tintersfield House installation, and you'll, what will come up are really ugly pictures. And even the BBC, wrote an article, published an article on the fact that it basically does look like excrement. But, I didn't actually see any proper defence of it. I mean, the thing I saw that was closest to a defence was, shut up, it's only going to be up for 2 months. I don't think that's a very convincing defence of the thing. Why is it up in the first place? I think the title of the piece is very telling. It's called The Uninvited Guest from the Unremembered Past. So it's sort of, and by the way, this thing is streaming out of the fireplace, for example. So it's sort of, apparently it's meant to be evocative of sort of, you know, I think, and this is what the title also evokes, but the National Trust website page on it, the web page on it, hinted at this, that it was evocative of sort of the dark histories or whatever of the place. And all of this is, as you say, you know, it's part of a much broader theme. How can we denigrate British history, British heritage, British culture? And I think, back to what I was saying earlier, I think, how do we depopularise the historic houses? I don't think the National Trust management, a lot of them like the houses themselves. They are focusing very, very heavily on nature, climate change, those sorts of things. Not by the way, with particular commitment to that either. I think it's just more financially viable to do that. And I think all of these things, you know, the Tinsfield House thing, I think all comes into that. They're trying to depopularise the historic houses. When you go there and you think, ugh, what is this? After a while, even the staunchest supporters of, you know, historic houses, the National Trust as it once was, are going to think, look, I just can't bring myself to visit these places. They've become so horrendous. And then, you know, I think it's sort of managed decline. I do think it's managed decline.
What can be done to turn this around?
It's a very good question. I do think that the majority of the British population would disagree with a lot of what's going on. Are we going to get very much done with at least 5 years of a Labour government in power, and a Labour government who have thought, you know, who think that the solution to the culture war stuff is saying we have ended the culture wars? I don't really know. Certainly not through government. Certainly there's no response through government. The fact that pressure continues to come down on these institutions through the media, through continued pressure from, you know, pressure groups like Restore Trust is very good. You know, Restore Trust, for example, have recommended 5 candidates to vote for National Trust members to vote for in these elections, as we were doing last year and the year before, and indeed the year before that. So there is potential for change if people come together.
So, Zewditu Gebreyohanes, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.